Melusine by Lynne Chapter 2, Goat Girl. Roger woke up very early despite his late night. A ray of sunshine pierced the screen on his little round window and touched his face with a dusty finger. He sat up in the narrow bed and put his feet onto the cold stone flags. By daylight, not that much got in, his small room didn't displease him. It was clean and simple. There were some shelves left over from its larder days, and he lost no time in unpacking and arranging on these his sketch pad, Mad Magazine, a current book of ghost stories, the lucky owl that went with him everywhere, and his clock radio. Except there was nowhere to plug it in, which was rather irritating. His clothes he left in a jumble in his case. Then he pulled on some shorts, sandals, and a t-shirt, and went out of the room. Their kitchen, as clean and modern as the other one had been old-fashioned and filthy, was flooded with sunlight. It was also absolutely abuzz with flies. Except last night in the other kitchen, Roger had never seen so many. They were all over everything. He quickly closed the door to his room to keep them out. There hadn't been one in there, due to the screen window, and he meant to keep it that way. His mother had brought a cardboard box of groceries to tide them over till they could get to the local village shops. He helped himself to some crisp bread and peanut butter, and slipped out of the back door into the French morning. The air smelled entirely different from home. The animal smell was very strong now. It was like a cow smell, but not quite. Under that dominating one, there were others. Faint, vagrant scents that he couldn't identify. They must have come from flowers unknown in England, or perhaps it was just something in the air. The grass and trees looked just the same. An area of rough grass that had obviously never seen a lawnmower, stretched away from the back step to a broken stone wall. Beyond was countryside, empty of people and infinitely alluring. Roger hurled himself into a fast, exuberant run at the broken area of the wall and leaped over it. He found himself in a rutted lane overhung by tall trees. He followed it to the right, keeping parallel with the chateau, which was on the other side of the wall. The chateau really was enormous. Its squat round tower with its turret and weathercock was the tallest part. It was 3 stories high to the chateau's 2. The rest took the form of an E without its middle prong. And there was a second tower at the other angle, but this was in ruins. It took Roger 4 minutes by his digital watch to walk to a turning in the lane, indicating the size of the building. There must be other people living here, he thought. How could just Monsieur Serpet and his daughter and summer visitors live in all that? More walking brought him around to the back. Suddenly, the stable smell was stronger than ever, making him want to hold his nose. He heard an outburst of country noise. A mass bleating? Sheep? He began to run. A break in the wall, which had once contained a tall gate, now corroding off its hinges, led him to a corner of the chateau. Built carelessly against the high stone wall was a large shelter, open on 2 sides. It was just stout wooden props with a corrugated iron roof. Around it was a fence. Inside, it was floored with thick straw, and scattered everywhere, bleating and capering, were dozens of goats. Roger stopped short, staring. He had seen the odd goat before, usually large, rather fierce-looking creatures, tethered in fields or behind a gypsy's caravan. But these were small and appealing, mostly brown and white, with soft floppy ears and little beards and inquisitive bony faces. Their small tails wagged cheerily as they wandered or jumped about. Most of them had horns, and all of them had udders. Roger might not have noticed the udders, except that someone was in the midst of the herd, very busy getting milk out of them. She was a girl about his own age, or a bit older. He couldn't see anything except her back at first. She had long black hair, pulled into a pigtail. She wore filthy jeans and a green t-shirt with a diamond pattern on it. She sat on a tiny 3-legged stool, bent with her head against the goat's flank. Through the bird song, fly buzzing and bleating, Roger could hear the steady dring, 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 dring of the streams of milk hitting the tin pail. When she'd finished that goat, she stood up, picked up the pail and the stool, and moved over to another, grabbed it fearlessly by the horns, and dragged it to where she wanted it. With astonishing nimbleness, she kicked the stool into position and sat on it, drew the pail into place with one hand, and proceeded to milk the goat. Roger, lurking in the shadows, timed her 4.5 minutes. Then she let the goat go and carried the pail through a doorway into the darkness of a corner of the chateau. He waited. When she came out again, having emptied the pail, she saw him standing at the fence. She stopped dead for a moment, then without a flicker of a smile, she walked on. This time, the goat she wanted frisked its head and began to move away as soon as she began to milk. The girl tried to grab one of its horns and accidentally kicked the pail over. Luckily, there wasn't much in it. "Merde!" she exclaimed furiously. Roger, knowing this was a swear word, grinned. He climbed over the fence and approached. "Can I help?" he asked. She stared at him. Her eyes were very strange, round and black like coat buttons, without expression. She had a very wide mouth with thin, pale lips. Her face was an even brown, with a smooth forehead going straight back into her tightly pulled back hair. Her mouth twitched and the buttony eyes half closed. "Tu veux m'aider?" He blinked. It sounded so different when real French people spoke French, but he'd hoped he'd understood and said, "Oui, avec les chèvres?" Ah, that's right. Chèvre was a goat. He nodded eagerly. "Alors, tiens!" Tiens, she made 2 fists. Hold on. Hesitantly, Roger reached toward the goat's horns. It gave a strong twist of its head, then dashed away to the far side of the pen. "Idiot!" she shouted. It sounded like "ideo," but he guessed she meant him, not the goat. "Sorry, shall we catch it? Eh?" He racked his brains. "Est-ce que nous chassons elle?" Oh, hell, this is going to be impossible. "Don't you speak any English?" he asked despairingly. For an answer, she tossed her head and, handing him the pail and the stool, took off in quest of a goat. She caught one almost at once and beckoned him imperiously with her head to bring her equipment. When he reached her, she grabbed the things away from him and as good as handed him the goat. This time, he was determined not to let it go. He got in front of it and grabbed its horns with both hands. It butted him in the thigh, but with its head firmly held, it was helpless. He tested his strength against the goat's and found he was much stronger. It gave him a good feeling. Next time, she let him do the catching, and now she laughed at him unmercifully as he ran after 2 or 3 at once, scattering the flock in all directions. Setting his teeth, he concentrated on just one, chased it all around the pen, finally cornered it, grabbed its horns, and dragged it back in triumph. She was bent double, almost helpless with laughter. As she threw her head back, her small white teeth flashed in the sun. "Que es so humorous?" he panted furiously. "What's so funny?" She bent and flipped the goat's empty udder. He groaned. All that for a goat she'd already milked. His arms dropped, and the goat skipped off with a derisive twitch of its tail. But it was funny. Even he could see that. "Well, which one, then?" he asked, spreading his hands like a Frenchman. She scanned her flock and pointed. "Celui-là!" How on earth could she remember which one she'd done? He headed the goat straight into the corner where he'd got the other one and caught it quite effectively this time. She rewarded him with a guarded smile, her round black eyes now shining. But whether with amusement or approval, he couldn't tell. While she milked, and he hung on, he asked, "Comment tu appelles?" This came out rather well, he thought. "Melusine," she answered, her forehead pressed to the goat's warm flank. "Et toi?" "Raja," he said. He heard him give it the French pronunciation. His French teacher made him use phony. he thought to himself, but it was out now. When the pail needed emptying again, after about 3 goats, he followed her through the door into a dim, cool room within the stone walls of the chateau, which did duty as a dairy. Here, too, there were about 1,000,000 flies. After a little reflection, he felt safe remarking as casually as possible, "Beaucoup de monches?" She nodded, lifting a muslin cover and pouring the milk into a large churn. Emboldened, he went on, "Tuos, besoin de..." He couldn't remember the word for frogs, which was ironic because some kids in his class called all French people frogs. If there were, they'd be a lot fewer flies. When he thought of this, he couldn't help laughing, and Melusine turned to look at him. "Besoin de quoi?" she asked sharply. He decided to mime it. Crouching, he stretched his mouth with 2 fingers into a froggy grimace and began hopping about, snapping at flies. She looked blank. He snapped harder, too hard. A fly actually flew into his mouth, and he stopped hopping and snapping and spit it out. She stared at him. She who had nearly fallen over laughing at his efforts to catch her goats. For her didn't seem to see anything funny about his comic performance. He scrambled up sheepishly. "J'ai fini," she said shortly, not a word of thanks or even goodbye. She opened another door into the main part of the house, leaving him to find his own way back to his part around the outside. Some of the goats raised their heads as he went by, and he imagined they gave him goatish smirks. And that's the end of chapter 2.